On a humid August night in 1973, Beale Street in Memphis was alive with neon glow and restless footsteps. Hundreds passed by a ragged boy hunched over a battered guitar. But when Elvis Presley's limousine stopped dead in traffic, 300 strangers held their breath, because what happened next would change that boy's life forever. Beale Street in August of 1973 was a place where sound itself seemed to sweat. Neon lights flickered above the old brick storefronts, each glow reflected in puddles left by an afternoon rain. The hum of traffic mixed with laughter from bars, the shuffle of shoes, and the occasional brass notes spilling from a half-open door. Among that restless motion sat a boy, cross-legged on the sidewalk, pressed against a chipped wall outside Beale Records. He held a guitar that looked more like wreckage than an instrument. The body was cracked, 2 strings gone, the others rusted dull. Yet he strummed it anyway, his head bent low, brown hair hanging into his eyes. His name was Tommy Rivers, though to most that night he was invisible. Martha Lee, who had tended the shop for 20 years, noticed him first. She watched from her counter as people streamed by, some turning their heads, some muttering about the noise. Still, Tommy kept playing, his voice thin, fragile, but steady. Was it music? Or just the cry of someone trying not to disappear? Then, as if guided by chance, a long black limousine crawled down Beale Street. Its polished sides reflected the neon signs as though the car itself were made of liquid light. Inside sat Elvis Presley, returning from rehearsal at Graceland, flanked by his friend and bodyguard, Joe Esposito. Elvis leaned against the window, watching the blur of the city he once walked as a hungry teenager himself. Traffic slowed. The limo inched forward until its headlights poured directly over the boy with the battered guitar. For a moment, Tommy squinted into the glare but kept his hands moving. The sound was rough, untrained, but it carried something real, and in that instant, a curious energy moved through the crowd. People who had ignored the boy suddenly looked again because the limousine had stopped. Its engine hummed, lights shining like a spotlight on the forgotten teenager. 300 pedestrians stretched their necks, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Joe leaned closer to Elvis. "It's late," he said, almost a warning. But Elvis didn't answer. He just watched the boy, lips parted slightly, as if hearing more in those cracked notes than anyone else could. Can a single voice, raw and imperfect, cut through the noise of a whole city? And what makes one man stop when hundreds just keep walking? The crowd's chatter softened. A tourist whispered, "That's Elvis, isn't it?" Another pulled out a camera. Martha Lee stepped outside her shop door, holding her breath. Something was building in the air, a pressure that made even the cicadas fall silent. Then, the unthinkable. The limousine's brake lights flared bright red, and the car came to a full stop. The boy played on, unaware that his audience had changed forever. Who could have predicted what would follow? The limousine idled at the curb, its low rumble vibrating through the pavement. Pedestrians slowed, sensing that something was unfolding, though no one could quite name it. Tommy Rivers kept his head bowed, fingers fumbling against the strings, singing words half forgotten. His voice cracked on the high notes, but in the faint tremor lived an honesty that stopped even time-worn strangers. Inside the limo, Joe Esposito shifted uneasily. "Too many people," he murmured, watching faces crowd near the car. Flashbulbs already began to pop as tourists realized who was inside. It wasn't unusual for Elvis to draw a scene, but this was different. There was no stage, no microphone, no safety of distance. Just a boy with a broken guitar, Elvis pressed his hand against the glass, eyes narrowing as though he were trying to see past the rough surface of the performance to something buried deeper. A note lingered in the humid night air, wavered, and nearly died out. But the boy caught it, steadied it, and began again. Elvis tilted his head, listening harder. The driver asked softly, "Sir, do you want me to keep going?" And here was the disruption. This was not the plan. Elvis had rehearsals, commitments, expectations stacked on him like bricks. A star of his size did not stop on a crowded street corner at random. It invited chaos, danger. But the boy kept playing, each chord buzzing through the hot night, unpolished yet relentless. The crowd pressed closer, murmurs rising. "What's he doing?" one woman asked, clutching her purse as she tried to see. "Why is the car stopping?" Another whispered, "That's Elvis in there, isn't it?" From his doorway, shopkeeper Martha Lee stepped forward, craning her neck. She had heard many hopefuls strum guitars on Beale, but never had a single performance caused a limousine to stall in its tracks. She crossed her arms, heart thudding. Was this moment about to vanish as quickly as it appeared? Then it happened. Elvis lowered the window, just a crack, letting the humid night rush in. The sound of the boy's guitar filled the car like smoke, thin and imperfect but undeniable. Joe tensed, glancing at Elvis. "Boss, this isn't safe. We should go." But Elvis didn't move. His gaze stayed locked on Tommy Rivers, who was oblivious to the audience gathering, lost in his ragged melody. A song without title, without structure, just chords stitched together by Hope Dot. Can you imagine being that boy, playing to survive, never knowing who might be listening? And can you imagine being the man who had everything, yet still found his heart caught by a street song? The hush spread wider, rippling outward. A car honked impatiently somewhere behind the limousine, but no one stepped forward to break the spell. Tourists whispered. Locals paused mid-stride. It was as if the whole block leaned in, waiting for a decision. Elvis shifted in his seat. His foot tapped once, twice. The rhythm was there, hidden beneath the broken strings, waiting to be uncovered. He inhaled deeply, and Joe knew the look. This wasn't just curiosity. It was recognition. The driver cleared his throat, "Sir." Elvis leaned back, then forward again, elbows on his knees. "Hold it here," he said. His voice carried a weight that ended the debate, and with those words, the ordinary became extraordinary. For in that moment, it wasn't just a boy playing for coins. It was an uninvited audition, and the king of rock and roll was the only judge who mattered. But what would Elvis do next? The limo door opened with a slow creak, slicing through the humid Memphis night like the start of a scene no one had rehearsed. A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd, 300 strangers suddenly united in disbelief. Elvis Presley was stepping out, right there on Beale Street, without warning, without a stage, and without a plan. Cameras flashed instantly, the popping bulbs mixing with the buzzing neon. Tourists surged forward, elbows colliding, voices breaking into a chaotic chorus. Some shouted his name. Others whispered as if too stunned to believe it was real. And yet, amid the rising noise, one pocket of silence remained, the boy on the sidewalk, still strumming his guitar. Too locked in survival to even stop playing. Joe Esposito hurried out behind Elvis, his frame tense, his voice low. "Boss, this isn't safe," he insisted, scanning the gathering circle of onlookers. He motioned to security, who began weaving through the crowd to form a barrier. But Elvis barely acknowledged them. His eyes were fixed on Tommy Rivers, as if the rest of the world had blurred out of focus. The tension hung heavy. On one side, security, pressing for control, urging caution, fearing the crush of the crowd. On the other, Elvis, slowing his steps, drawn closer by something only he seemed to hear. Which way would it break? The boy's voice cracked again, fragile and uneven, and a few in the crowd chuckled cruelly. "He can't even sing." Someone muttered. Another scoffed, "Waste of time," but others leaned in, hushed, recognizing the weight of the moment. The contrast sharpened ridicule against reverence, impatience against compassion. Which would win? Martha Lee pushed to the front, her hands folded anxiously at her waist. She knew the boy had slept in alleys, begged for food, wandered in and out of her shop just to hear the records spin. Now the city's most famous son was standing before him. "Lord," she whispered under her breath, "let this be kind." Elvis stopped just a step away from Tommy. The boy's strumming faltered at last, his eyes darting up, wide and uncertain. He saw who stood there. His lips parted, but no sound came. The crowd leaned forward collectively, the noise thinning into a restless hush. Could you feel it? That sudden shift when hundreds of people hold their breath at once. The arena of Beale Street went dead silent, as if Memphis itself paused to listen. Joe touched Elvis's shoulder. "Sir, we've got to move." His voice was urgent, tinged with real fear now. If the crowd pressed closer, if chaos broke loose, things could turn dangerous fast. Elvis didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on Tommy, and with the faintest tilt of his head, he seemed to say, "Wait, a midhook rises here. How quickly can a street corner become a stage?" The silence stretched taut, and then broke not with words, but with action. Elvis crouched down, lowering himself until he was level with the boy on the sidewalk. The flashbulbs exploded again, and the crowd gasped as if watching something legendary take shape. The boy's hand trembled over the strings. He whispered, "I'm not good." Elvis smiled gently, his voice low but carrying. "Son, you just keep playing." Gasps gave way to murmurs. Some clapped, others cheered, but the louder reaction was awe. A superstar had defied protocol, ignored warnings, and chosen compassion in front of 300 strangers. Yet the moment was not finished, because what Elvis would do next would test the fragile balance between fear and faith, between order and humanity. And the crowd leaned in closer still, waiting. Elvis knelt lower, his sequined jacket catching the neon glow, and for a moment he looked less like a king and more like a man remembering his own hungry youth. Tommy Rivers froze, the battered guitar sliding slightly in his lap. His breath quickened, eyes darting nervously toward the crowd now pressing tighter. A hush spread outward, rolling through the mass of people like a wave. Even the impatient car horns had gone silent, as though Memphis itself sensed the weight of this unscripted encounter. Elvis leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper, yet strong enough for those nearby to hear. "Play it again, son." The words struck Tommy like lightning. His fingers hovered over the strings, shaking. Short bursts of sound sputtered out one note, then another, jagged and broken. The crowd bent forward. Cameras clicked. Security bristled, urging Elvis to stand. Yet he stayed rooted, eyes locked on the boy. Then came a note that lingered, unexpectedly pure, hanging in the humid night air. Dead silent, the street froze around it. Tommy blinked, startled by his own sound, then pressed forward. Chords formed, fragile but deliberate. Elvis nodded in rhythm, subtle at first, then stronger, his foot tapping against the pavement. The boy drew courage from it, his voice rising a little louder. It cracked again, but this time Elvis grinned, encouraging, as though imperfection itself was the beauty worth hearing. Can you imagine that feeling facing the man who filled arenas, who conquered Las Vegas, and having him ask you to sing once more? Would you find your voice, or would fear swallow it whole? Tommy's strumming steadied. The rusted strings buzzed, yet the song emerged. Elvis lifted a hand, signaling the crowd to quiet further, though they were already spellbound. The silence now felt sacred, the only sound that battered guitar echoing between the brick walls of Beale. Joe Esposito shifted anxiously, muttering into a guard's ear, but even he didn't dare interrupt. He too had felt it, the fragile thread connecting boy and legend. Woven so tightly it could snap at the slightest intrusion. A pattern breaker landed here. Elvis placed a gentle hand on the guitar itself, steadying it. The crowd gasped audibly. A superstar's jeweled fingers on a street boy's broken instrument contrast, so stark it seemed almost impossible. The boy swallowed hard, but his playing grew bolder. Sweat beaded on his brow. His voice cracked once more, but this time the crowd didn't laugh. They leaned closer, mesmerized. And when he hit a run of clear notes, something shifted in the atmosphere. Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then swelling, carried like a tide. Elvis looked at Tommy and gave a small, firm nod. "That's it," he murmured. The crowd roared approval, and Tommy's eyes filled, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and relief. This was no longer a forgotten boy in the shadows. For those few minutes, he was a performer, lifted onto an invisible stage by the belief of a man who knew the power of being heard. What happened next would not only change the night, it would change the boy's life. The chords carried on, rough but now steadier, echoing against the storefronts. The boy's voice, once drowned by traffic, rose above the hush of 300 strangers. Elvis clapped softly in rhythm, coaxing him onward. The crowd joined with tentative snaps, then claps, until Beale Street itself seemed to pulse with the music. Tommy's eyes widened, disbelief plain on his face. He had been invisible an hour ago, a nameless shadow with a broken guitar. Now the king of rock and roll was clapping to his song. Could a single, compassionate pause really rewrite destiny? A white scarf slipped from Elvis's neck as he leaned forward. Without flourish, he placed it gently into Tommy's guitar case. The artifact glowed under neon light, a token transformed into something legendary. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman whispered. He gave him his scarf, and the news spread instantly from one mouth to another. The ripple became action. A man in a suit dropped a handful of coins beside the scarf. Another knelt, tucking a folded bill into the case. A young woman unclasped her silver bracelet and placed it carefully next to the rusted strings. Within minutes, Tommy's case was filled with offerings, not just money, but symbols of dignity. Martha Lee, still standing near her shop door, wiped her eyes. She had seen plenty of hopeful musicians, but never the street itself transformed into a stage of generosity. "He's not alone anymore," she whispered. The boy strummed harder now, confidence blooming. His voice cracked less, his notes bolder. Elvis lifted his head, scanning the crowd, as if silently asking them to lift this moment higher. And they did. A chorus of strangers began humming, then singing softly along. The effect was staggering. The boy's shaky melody carried by hundreds of voices, a street corner swelling into something greater than any one person. Imagine being there, cars halted, businesses paused, 300 strangers united not by fame, but by compassion. Doesn't it make you wonder how often we walk past miracles because we are too busy to notice? Tourists snapped photographs furiously, but many forgot their cameras and simply watched. A young child climbed onto her father's shoulders to see better, clapping along. Even the security guards, at first tense, softened, their shoulders lowering as they let the moment unfold. Elvis nodded once more to Tommy, eyes shining. The boy smiled faintly through tears, strumming until the final chord rang out. The sound hung in the summer air before dissolving into thunderous applause. And in that applause, something undeniable had shifted. The crowd was no longer a restless collection of strangers. They had become a community, bound together by a moment of music, compassion, and the decision of one man to stop. But the story didn't end on that street. The echoes of what happened next would ripple for decades. Long after the crowd dispersed and the neon lights dimmed, the memory of that night lingered. Within days, whispers spread across Memphis. Elvis stopped for a street musician. Local papers ran small features, grainy photographs of the moment, headlines framing it as a curious interruption in the King's busy schedule. But for those who had stood on Beale Street, it was more than a headline. It was living proof that compassion could stop time. Martha Lee often retold it to customers in her record shop. "I saw it with my own eyes," she'd say, her voice catching. That boy wasn't nobody anymore. For her, it became a touchstone, a reminder that even legends remembered where they came from. Tommy Rivers, the boy with the broken guitar, carried the memory like a flame. Some claimed he went on to play juke joints across the Mississippi Delta. Others swore he returned to Beale often, performing with a little more confidence each time. His story was never fully recorded, but those who knew him said one night with Elvis gave him the belief to keep going. Years later, the city of Memphis installed a plaque along Beale Street. Bronze letters read, "In August 1973, Elvis Presley paused here to honor the music of a street performer," reminding us that every voice deserves to be heard. Tourists still stop to photograph it, many unaware of the boy's name but deeply moved by the act itself. The legend continued in subtler ways. Parents told their children about the night Elvis chose to listen instead of hurry past. Musicians spoke of it as proof that greatness could kneel beside humility. And in each retelling, the story changed a little, but its heart remained the same. Can a 5-minute pause echo for 50 years? On Beale Street, the answer still hums through the air, woven into every guitar note that drifts out of the clubs at night. It is not just Elvis's music that remains, it is the lesson he left behind in a moment unscripted, unforgettable and legendary. When the night ended and Elvis's limousine finally pulled away, Beale Street slowly returned to its rhythm. Yet for those who witnessed it, the city felt changed forever. They hadn't just seen a superstar. They had seen compassion in motion. Elvis, a man who could fill coliseums, chose instead to kneel beside a forgotten boy. That decision didn't require rehearsals, contracts, or cameras. It required only the courage to pause, to notice, and to listen. Sometimes the most legendary stages aren't arenas, but sidewalks lit by neon. And sometimes the audience isn't thousands, says a few hundred strangers holding their breath together. Tommy Rivers' name may fade from history, but the spirit of that night does not. The applause, the scarf. The coins and tokens dropped into his case. They became symbols of something greater. Dignity restored, hope rekindled. What do we remember most about legends? The records they sold, or the moments when they chose to act with kindness? Perhaps it is both. Perhaps greatness is measured not only in songs, but in silence, broken by compassion. So the story of Beale Street remains, passed down like a melody. It reminds us that we all carry the chance to stop, to notice, to lift someone unseen. Elvis showed that even the briefest gesture can ripple outward, touching lives far beyond what we imagine. And maybe the truest stage any of us will stand on is the moment when we decide to care. Stories like this remind us that kindness can be legendary. If Elvis's pause on Beale Street moved you, share this video with someone who believes small acts matter. Tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed compassion that changed everything? And stay with us for more untold moments that inspire.